Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I have the video version up now, which is a blast from the past because I haven't been on video for probably over a year, so bear with me here. This episode, I am grappling with a topic that was brought to my, conscious thought last night. We had an online happy hour, virtual happy hour with the Libertarian Party that we're trying to create in my local area. So we had a good time. We were actually spammed by someone who got the Zoom link and started playing pornography. So that's the argument that you get from the left is I'd like to think that libertarians wouldn't do that to other people but it was something interesting that happened, but we were able to restart the whole link and keep talking. And one of the topics that came up was I had been playing around with this idea that nation states exist in a state of anarchy because, as Murray Rothbard points out in the Ethics of Liberty, it's a well-known and well-accepted thing in the field of international relations that nation states exist in a state of anarchy. Even though there is the United Nations or the League of Nations back in the past, to date, for most of human history and civilization, there has been no such thing as an overarching authority that rules over various nations, states, because the state and the nation are two different things, according to Murray Rothbard's Nations by Consent. So I've tried to prepare a little bit for this, but, you can kind of, with the limited free time that I have, and hence why the show hasn't been around for quite some time, I decided that I would just kind of get into it. And of course, I'm live streaming here, so you can check that out at libertyweekly.net/YouTube. My YouTube channel, just search Liberty Weekly, and you'll see the video version with my smiling and lovely face. So I'm going to be reading a little bit from the Ethics of Liberty just to kind of frame this issue. And so I'm on page 191 of the Ethics of Liberty. This is chapter The Relations of States, on relations between states, chapter 25 of the Ethics of Liberty. Oh, and before I get in, I wanted to mention, I'm sorry, Ron Paul yesterday had a health emergency, and I had seen the video, unfortunately, and I was very affected by it, and I wish the best for Ron Paul. My prayers go out to the Paul family and Ron Paul. I didn't want to come out with a Ron Paul video about how I've been affected by Ron Paul and how Ron Paul brought me into the Liberty movement, because I figured everyone would be making videos about that, and mine would just be one of many stories. So maybe I'll make a video about that for Patreon supporters, patreon.com/Liberty Weekly. And I'll just leave it at that. Obviously, Ron Paul is a huge hero of mine. He inspires me every day to be a better person and to be a better professional. So much respect to Ron Paul, and I hope that, it seems like he's doing well, so I hope he continues to do well. And, unfortunately, there's going to come a day when Ron Paul is not with us, just like Murray Rothbard, and I rue that day, but it will come, and we'll carry on his torch and legacy without him. So, well, anyways, speaking of late and great libertarians, here's the words of Murray Rothbard. So he says on the bottom of page 191 of the Ethics of Liberty, let us now bring the state into our discussion, since each state arrogates to itself a monopoly of violence over a territorial area. So long as its depredations and extortions go unresisted, there is said to be peace within the area. Since the only violence is continuing in one way, directed by the state downward against its people, open conflict within the area only breaks out in the case of, quote, revolutions, which might be a topic that I'd like to discuss using the words of Murray Rothbard, since it seems like we're on the cusp of a civil conflict, perhaps, in November. But revolutions in which people resist the use of state power against them. Yeah, that's not what we're facing. Both the quiet case of the state unresisted and the case of open revolution may be termed, quote, vertical violence, violence of the state against its public, or vice versa. In the existing world, each land area is ruled over by a state organization with a number of states scattered over the earth, each with a monopoly of violence over its own territory. No superstate exists with a monopoly of violence over the entire world, and so a state of anarchy exists between the several states. And so, except for revolutions, which occur only sporadically, the open violence and two-sided conflict in the world takes place between two or more states, i.e. what is called, quote, international war, or horizontal violence. So he frames this issue, and I mean, this chapter of the Ethics of Liberty is not about, it's not about the topic that I'm discussing today, but it really ponders this idea of, okay, well, if the world already does exist in a state of anarchy, and we have the natural result of this throughout human history has always resulted in the creation of states. And maybe that isn't, I don't think that defeats the idea that anarchy is something that we should strive for, or a situation where no state exists, a stateless society. It is curious, and I think it's something that libertarians have to deal with, the fact that it has been the result. And just the fact that, you know, if we are existing in a state of anarchy, states spring up, states fight with each other, and that is the result. So I'm going to, actually, what I wanted to do was, if you're watching the video version here, you can see on the screen, this is the chapter of the Ethics of Liberty. I'll put a link in the show notes for you to download it, unless you have your own paper copy. But of course you can find that at Mises.org. Just type in the Ethics of Liberty, and at Mises. But this is the piece that I'm going to be talking about today, and I didn't get a chance to read through it. I thought I would read through some excerpts here. This kind of tackles the question that I'm bringing up, and I'm sure I'm dabbling in things that, you know, the old guard of libertarians, people who have been around the movement and longer, much longer than I have, probably know who this Randall G. Holcomb person is, but he wrote this article, and I'll put a link in the show notes page to it as well, entitled Government Unnecessary but Inevitable. And from what I have gathered, this Randall G. Holcomb, he's a DeVoe Moore professor of economics at Florida State University. What I can gather is that he is a libertarian, but he's more of a minarchist. He sides a bit more with Robert Nozick and actually mentions a lot of arguments that Robert Nozick makes. But let's just take a dive here. I'll start by reading off a little bit in the beginning and just kind of pause for my own commentary here. So he begins, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman, perhaps the best-known 20th century academic defenders of liberty, envisioned a role for limited government in protecting liberty. Friedman's 1962 defense of freedom includes proposals for a negative income tax and school vouchers. Hayek, 1960, advocates limited government to enforce the rule of law despite his concern about excessive government. And Ludwig von Mises, who also warns of the dangers of big government, states, the task of the state consists solely and exclusively in guaranteeing the protection of life, health, liberty, and private property against violent attacks. My point to that is there's always, and I've underlined this a lot in my shows, that there is an inherent logical inconsistency here, that in order to protect against, to protect life, health, liberty, and private property, a state must violate people's rights to life, health, liberty, and private property. And perhaps you can make the utilitarian argument that, well, if, you know, we entrust the ring of power to a select proper group of people, we all sacrifice 10% of our life, health, liberty, and private property to create a system which would protect the 90% and would do it much better than, you know, in an anarchic state. And I think what we're seeing here in the United States in the past few months over this summer has been more of a situation where we have mob rule and the kind of anarchy that, when I talk about anarchy to my parents who are conservative, kind of your, I don't know, your average, maybe perhaps Law and Order conservatives, but liberty works. You know, they would have the position that we need a state to protect liberty. Maybe not even a minimal state, but I digress. Whenever I mention the term anarchy, I think what pops up in their mind is mob rule, this idea of no law and order, no due process, just a mob that goes around burning and threatening buildings. And it's not even like an organized mob like the mafia or anything like that. But so in contrast, by the end of the 20th century, many libertarians, guided by the work of Murray Rothbard and others, viewed orderly anarchy as a desirable and potentially achievable state of affairs, and some would argue the only state of affairs consistent with the libertarian philosophy. I just posited that case. So my purpose in this article is to examine that proposition critically and to defend and extend the classical liberal idea of limited government. My conclusions align more with those theorists such as Hayek and Mises, who see a need for limited government, than with those who see the libertarian ideal as an orderly anarchy. The debate over limited government versus orderly anarchy typically turns on the effectiveness of government versus private means to achieve certain ends. No, it does not. I would argue that if you're bringing Rothbard into this, and he purports an orderly anarchy. I mean, Rothbard makes the case that, you know, private organizations would be more effective than government ones. Of course, he makes that case, but fundamentally, Rothbard comes from a natural rights position and a philosophical, ethical position that the only state that we should strive for is orderly anarchy, as Holcomb puts it. So, and that's how Rothbard really departed from people such as David Friedman and utilitarians, and very strongly so departed from them. So I right away here, I think it's incorrect to say that maybe he means from an objective point of view, the debate over limited government versus orderly anarchy turns on the effectiveness of government versus private means to achieve certain ends. But that is not that's not the reason why I am a voluntarist. And I don't think it's the reason that Murray Rothbard was either. He continues, government's defenders argue that markets cannot provide certain goods and services as efficiently as government can. In some cases, markets may be completely unable to provide certain desired goods, whereas the advocates of orderly anarchy argue that private contractual arrangements can provide every good and service more effectively and can do so without the coercion inherent in government activity. I maintain, however, that the effectiveness of government versus that of private arrangements to produce goods and services is irrelevant to the issue of the desirability of government in a libertarian society. Governments are not created to produce goods and services for citizens. Rather, they are created and imposed on people by force, most often for the purpose of transferring resources from the control of those outside government to the control of those within it. So, you know, Holcomb's he's a fellow traveler here. He's not a bad guy. Of course, I disagree with him, but I think he makes interesting points here. Without government, or even with a weak government, predatory groups will impose themselves on people by force and create a government to extract income and wealth from these subjects. If people create their own government preemptively, they can design a government that may be less predatory than the one that outside aggressors otherwise would impose on them. So it seems to me he's advocating for the occasional, the creeping government, the one that's, we are the frogs in the boiling pot. And I hope, and I look for something that he might deal with would be an idea that a limited government will produce in the long run the most powerful society, that is the most prosperous one, such as the United States, and it will hijack it. But I wonder also if he tries to deal with the notion or confront the notion that, well, those least desirable to wield the power of government are the ones who seek the power to wield the government. So he phrased, and he mentions Robert Higgs, and I'm not going to go over this chapter here where he lays out anarchy as an alternative to government. I'll just summarize it here, but I won't read it because this is all we talk about on the show for the most part. So he does mention kind of this utilitarian argument that, it's just a matter of, it has nothing to do with ethics. It's just that libertarian anarchists put forward that anarchy is more efficient. I see. Okay, so a second strand, he says, is the proposition that government is unethical because of its use of force. Okay, so I condemned you a little bit too early here, Holcomb. I apologize. So Murray Rothbard, he correctly states, has been the leading proponent of both arguments, that the efficiency argument and the ethical argument. He mentions for New Liberty, it's his most direct defense of orderly anarchy. He illustrates how the private sector can undertake more effectively all government activities, including national defense. He says all of Rothbard's arguments are persuasive, but his national defense argument is worth reviewing here because it has direct relevance to my thesis. Rothbard argues first that national defense is needed only because the governments of some countries have differences with the governments of others. Wars occur between governments, not between the subjects of those governments. Without a government to provoke outsiders, outside governments would have no motivation to attack, so a group of people living in anarchy would face a minimal risk of invasion from a foreign government. An auxiliary line of reasoning is that if a government does try to use military force to take over an area with no government, such a takeover would be very difficult because the aggressor would have to conquer each individual in the anarchistic area. If those people have a government, a foreign country has only to induce the other country's head of state to surrender in order to take over that other country. But in taking over a country without a government, an aggressor faces the much more daunting task of getting everyone to surrender, going from house to house and from business to business, a formidable and perhaps impossible undertaking. So just as an aside here, this kind of, it does really seem that Holcomb is putting forward, or at least more effectively underlining, the main point of this episode, which is that, well, throughout history, so states exist in anarchy. Well, the natural result is for states to come about. At least that's what we have observed. And, of course, that's why I'm doing this video. So, he mentioned Jeffrey Rogers Hummel. And I believe he made that awesome, incredible book about, the Civil War that I bought and I think is sitting on the shelf behind me. Somewhat libertarian guy, if I recall. I know that, the Dangerous History podcast has done a piece on multiple series on the Civil War, using primarily Hummel's piece, if he's the same guy. So he argues that national defense against foreign aggression is a subset of the problem of protecting people from any state, domestic or foreign. And Hummel notes that if people can design institutions to protect themselves from domestic government, those same institutions should suffice to protect them from foreign governments. In this line of reasoning, the private production of defense services would occur as a byproduct of the elimination of domestic government by an orderly anarchy. These arguments show the flavor of the argument that people would be better off without government. Orderly anarchy would eliminate the need for government provision of national defense because the risks of invasion would be lower and because the private sector can supply any defense services people want. Bob Murphy did a great piece on this. If I recall, Bob Murphy, it was very, very convincing argument that he made. So by considering there's a video at a Mises event where he explained exactly that, how a libertarian society would provide for national defense. And if I remember, I'll try and link that in the show notes page. So basically, private arrangements can provide for all of this. So thus the libertarian anarchist position rests heavily on the argument that anything the government does, the private sector can do more effectively and less coercively. Why do governments exist is the next part on page 328 of what I'll link in the show notes page of the Holcomb piece. The argument that people should do away with government because everything the government does, the private sector can do better would be persuasive if governments were created, as the rationale suggests, to improve their subjects' well-being. In fact, governments are not created to improve the public's well-being. In most cases, governments have been imposed on people by force, and they maintain their power by force for the purpose of extracting resources from subjects and transferring the control of those resources to those in government. Sometimes foreign invaders take over a territory and rule the people who live there. More commonly, people already subject to a government overthrow people already subject to a government overthrow it and establish a new government in its place. Whether government is more or less effective in producing public goods or in protecting private property is irrelevant. Interesting point here. Possible exception to this claim is the formation of the U.S. government. Basically, in this part, he talks about how the U.S. government was created to protect people's liberty. And he talks about history through that we've covered here and that I think everyone's familiar with. But he says the point here is straightforward. Despite many theories justifying government because its activities produce benefits to its citizens, no government was ever established to produce those benefits. Governments were created by force to rule over people and extract resources from them. Thus, the argument that citizens would be better off if they replace government activities with private arrangements and market transactions is irrelevant to the issue of whether an orderly anarchy would be a desirable or even feasible replacement for government. The real issue is whether a group of people with no government can prevent predators both inside and outside their group from using force to establish a government. And, perhaps Bob Murphy answered this pretty well in the video that I'll link. And if I was a bit more prepared, maybe I would play an excerpt from that here. Maybe I'll do that in just a bit. So protection and the state. Without government, this is page 329. Without government, people would be vulnerable to predators and therefore would have to find ways to protect themselves. In The Anarchy, Hobbes described life as a war of all against all, nasty, brutish, and short. The strong overpower the weak, taking everything the victims have, but the strong themselves do not prosper in Hobbesian anarchy because there is little for them to take. Nobody produces when the product will surely be taken away from them. Even under more orderly conditions than Hobbesian anarchy, predation has a limited payoff because people who have accumulated assets forcibly resist those who try to plunder them. In the ensuing battles, consume both predators' and victims' resources. One thing that I don't know if Holcomb is thinking about is this idea that without a state to support the war-going efforts of a certain people, they wouldn't be able to sustain those efforts. For instance, and maybe the example of the Vikings goes against this. Maybe it's a cultural thing, but the idea being that war is risky, conflict and violence is risky. It's also expensive. It produces, or it takes away from the net production of a certain society or the net resources that are available. And therefore, war is only sustainable when you have a state to skim off the top and take from some and give to others. In a situation where anarchy exists, there would be a society where maybe you would have a neighboring state to an anarchic area. Maybe that neighboring state would be able to skim resources from their populace and finance an army that could go across and take people. But I think it still is a convincing argument. But the prerequisite would be that you would have to, in that anarchic area, you would have to have a culture of rugged independence and rugged individualism of people that are ungovernable, of people that would not allow a state to subjugate them and take over resources. However, maybe history has provided situations where an rugged, independent, and individualist society has been subjugated by a state. Perhaps that's true. Disorganized banditry produces Hobbesian anarchy in which nobody prospers because nobody has an incentive to be productive. If the predators can organize, they may evolve into little mafias that can offer their clients some protection. This evolution will create a more productive society with more income for both the predators and their prey. But the mafias will have to limit their take in order for this outcome to arise. If the mafia can assure its clients that in exchange for payment they will be protected from other predators and allowed to keep a substantial portion of what they produce, output will increase and everybody's income can rise. Losses from rivalries among mafias will continue to be borne, however, because competing mafias have an incentive to plunder individuals who do not contract with them. If the mafias become even better organized, they can establish themselves as a state. Predators have every incentive to move from operating as bandits to operating as states, because bandits cannot guarantee themselves a long-term flow of income from predation, and because if banditry is rampant, people have little incentive to produce wealth. States try to convince citizens that they will limit their take and that they will protect their citizens in order to provide an incentive for those citizens to produce. Governments receive more income than bandits because governments can remain in one place and receive a steady flow of income rather than snatching once and moving on. In such a situation, citizens gain too. And he talks about Nozick here. Nozick describes this process in more benign terms. His protection agencies establish monopolies and evolve into a minimal state, but the evolutionary process is the same. The evolution of predatory bandits into mafias, protection firms, and thence into governments may be inevitable. If not inevitable, it is desirable because governments have an incentive to be less predatory than bandits or mafias. Citizens will be more productive, creating more for predators to take and more for citizens themselves to keep. The predators gain because they need only threaten to use force in order to induce the victims to surrender their property. Citizens benefit because they need not devote resources to using force in defense of their property. The government protects property except for the share it takes for itself. Successful predation of this type requires a particular institutional arrangement in which government makes a credible promise to limit its take and to protect its citizens from other predators. Only then do citizens have an incentive to produce much. Government has an incentive to protect citizens in order to protect its own source of income. He talks a little bit more about Rawls, Buchanan, and Tulloch, about how they have a very similar take, but it's a little bit different. But I wanted to go back a little bit here because every argument that Holcomb makes on page 329 and 330 rests on this crux of how he simply dismisses Rothbard's ethical points of view by saying that it is irrelevant because citizens don't, there's no market demand for government. Because government is inherently lorded over citizens. And I don't know if I accept that point, because everything that we, under why do governments exist, everything that Holcomb argues after that, it depends and rests on this logical thrust that citizens don't demand government. And I don't think that's true. I think citizens do demand government, and we see that all around us. Maybe it's true from, for argument's sake, that government inherently is a violent institution that conquers people and subjugates them. However, I don't think that means that there's no demand for government, because I certainly think that there is a large demand for government, and there's a demand for protection and these other services that government provides. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to provide for them without government if there was no demand for these services. So I don't know if I accept that argument from Holcomb here. And the ease with which he just kind of dismisses it. And he doesn't even confront this idea of how government is ethically wrong, and objectively, if you want to be a moral person and if morality matters to you, if you're not a libertarian and a right versus wrong answer matters to you, then it's certainly, even if empirically from that position, even if the market could provide better, which he dismisses, even if the market could not provide better, you would still have the ethical argument that it is better to have a society where people aren't allowed to aggress against other people because it's morally and ethically the correct position. I think you would still win there. So I don't want to go through this entire article. Let's see, I'm already at 30 minutes here. So let's kind of go through this, and I think that I'm going to try to look for Bob Murphy. If you'll bear with me here, I'm sorry, I know I'm live, but Bob Murphy, National Defense. I should have thought of this before I got on. So here's the video, the market for military defense. It was at a Mises U event, actually in July of 2019. So let's listen to a little bit of what Bob Murphy has to say, and I'll try not to make it go on forever here.
In a society without a coercive state, how could it defend itself? How could those people defend themselves? Wouldn't they be sitting ducks for some neighboring state, for example? And that's one of the standard objections. People might say, okay, yeah, sure, you guys could build roads. I could even possibly see, police and so forth. But come on, some neighboring state comes in with its modern military and you guys would be sitting ducks. And so that's the kind of thing I want to address right now. Let me let the cat out of the bag. I think that's a huge misconception. Even many committed anti-state libertarians, they still, will sometimes they give these throwaway lines like, oh yeah, the government can't get anything right except killing people. And I get where they're coming from, but actually, no, the government's not even very good at killing people. All right. And so what I mean is compared to if private business had the right incentives to do that. So normally that doesn't come up because private business isn't legally allowed and blah, blah, blah. But you'll see what I'm saying when I go through here, just like you wouldn't say, oh, well, I mean, if the apparatus of the state really threw itself behind wheat production, then the USSR would have really outproduced a capitalist society in terms of just, tonnage or bushels of wheat. And no, in general, that's not true. Just because the government really sets itself to some aim, that doesn't mean it actually satisfies it better than a private sector alternative would if it made economic sense to do so. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say here. I'm going to try to get you to see that this presumption, even on the part of many libertarians, that, oh yeah, the state, the one area where they're really good is organizing militaries and, blowing up other countries and that the only reason you think that is because right now it's states that dominate the production of military services. We don't really have something to compare it to. A lot of what I'm covering in this lecture, if you want to learn more about that and read more about it, look up my article. The journal's called Libertarian Papers. So it came out in 2017. The title is Libertarian Law and Military Defense. So that's where I elaborate on a lot of stuff I'm going to touch on for this talk. But now let's move into, okay, the real thorny question. Well, suppose you have a totally free society. There is no state apparatus. Now, how would they defend themselves from a military attack? So here, and I outline this again in the paper that I pointed you to, also my booklet, Chaos Theory, if you've seen that. And this is an elaboration. Rothbard talks about it in For New Liberty. I know Hoppe has an essay on the private production of defense. So the consensus seems to be that at least in a modern, let's call it Western society of the types most of us are familiar with, if those group of people all of a sudden turned ANCAP, how would they defend themselves? It would probably, the primary funding mechanism would probably come from the insurance sector. So just imagine a city like New York City. Okay, so there's all these skyscrapers. There's hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of property in a small area. And so just like, well, gee, what if there's a fire? How would a free society protect itself in case there's a fire? Well, there's fire insurance. Okay, and that's the way you spread the possibility of that loss among the whole population, that sort of thing. Likewise, I think there would be insurance contracts that would indemnify the owners of major pieces of property in the case of war damage or, being conquered from some outside army. So you've got major major insurance companies putting out these policies, collecting premiums on them. And now instead of just sitting back and saying, well, let's hope we don't get invaded, or just running the probabilities and charging a really high premium, the insurance companies would realize we can lower the probability of a successful foreign invasion or of this property being destroyed by bombers or tanks.
One quibble that I have with this is that I think Bob Murphy's point remains, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure that most property insurance contracts actually don't cover acts of war or civil insurrection. I might be wrong on that, but I think at the homeowners policies that I've looked through, there's actually an exclusion for acts of war or intentional acts like that. But then again, if you are an insurance provider and you have a whole bunch of basically your your clients or the people you're insuring, if they're basically wiped out, all killed, or their property is gone, then you're not going to have a good time. You're not going to have anyone to sell your insurance to. So just a little nuance. I wanted to add that.
if we engage in defense. Okay, just like, this isn't sci-fi stuff. Right now, fire insurance companies, if you have a large building, they'll give you lower premiums if you do things like show them that you have, sprinklers set up and you have fire extinguishers at strategic locations. You have smoke alarms, stuff like that, so that the fire insurance company knows the chance of this particular property being destroyed by a fire, and then us, the insurance company, having to indemnify the owner. That probability goes down if they have things in place like smoke alarms and sprinkler systems. And if we have a deal with the local fire department so that, if our sensors go off, we can have a truck there in 30 seconds or whatever. You get the idea. So, and they'll pass those premium savings along to the customer to induce them to be willing to fund those sorts of things. Okay, so something real obvious like putting in a sprinkler system for a huge skyscraper, you're not going to need government fire codes or building codes to ensure that happens. It's not that people in a free society don't know how fire works, okay? And something that's obvious, like spending whatever it is, a couple $1,000s to put in a sprinkler system for a multi-million-dollar apartment complex, you don't need government codes to force private owners to spend a few $1,000s for something that might avoid them millions of dollars in fire damage, right? And so I'm saying in practice, the way that kind of outcome would happen, absent government coercive fire codes, is something like the fire insurance company just, having in their contracts built-in things saying you do the X, Y, and Z, and we send inspectors periodically, right? Because the private owner might just say, oh yeah, we have a sprinkler system, go ahead and give us a lower premium, but maybe they really don't. Or maybe they installed it, but they're not staying on top of keeping it up, maintenance and so forth. So maybe the fire insurance company also has inspectors that just show up unannounced and do routine checks, and that's part of the contract. They have the right to do that and so forth. So a lot of the stuff that happens under the guise of government building regulations with fire codes and things like that, you could have analogs of that in a free society. I think the insurance sector would provide a lot of that. So likewise here, if there's a chance that some other country is going to send bombers and cause $1 billion worth of property damage, the first people that are going to suffer that would be the insurance companies. And so now they have the incentive to say, okay, instead of us just sitting here as sitting ducks, what if we instead paid some money to firms to set up surface-to-air missiles? Okay, and they could knock down incoming bombers. That greatly reduces the probability that these skyscrapers are going to be taken out by foreign bombers if we have SAM sites set up at strategic locations. All right, so the first hurdle to understand how could a free society exist without a political state engaging in large-scale taxation and then expenditures on military defense is, I think, the insurance sector would step up, and they would be the ones who would have the incentive and the ability, because they're taking premiums from all the property owners, or at least all the large property owners in the community, to make payments to private firms that engage in what we would call military defense. Okay, so that's the first thing I'll say here, and then so you can imagine things like this. I don't think there would be large standing armies. All right, just in terms of just picturing it, because for one thing, just that's expensive to have a huge standing army just sitting around in general. So I think that's expensive. And certainly they wouldn't have swastikas. That would be bad for PR, right? They wouldn't do that. But in general, I don't think it would make sense. Just in general, too, just like cities and northern cities can be ready in case there's a bad snowstorm, and they don't have thousands of people just sitting around all year on the off chance that there might be a really bad snowstorm, right? They have people that are doing other stuff that they could call up perhaps. Maybe a lot of the equipment they have in reserve, but they don't have people just sitting around for years on end on the off chance something happens. So likewise too, I just think in practice, large standing armies wouldn't make sense just business wise. And we'll see as we go through this why I don't think they'd also be necessary for military purposes. But to alleviate the concern, because that's a standard thing to say, oh, wouldn't these large, these firms that are providing private defense, why wouldn't they just turn into a state? Well, one reason I think is that they wouldn't have large standing armies. It wouldn't be millions of people in a given society that would be serving this function, for one thing. Okay, another thing I think we need to recognize here, and this is a strength. So the private defense firms are not allowed to just violate property rights and get away with it because, hey, there's a war on. And so I've talked to some people, even those who are sympathetic to libertarianism, And they think that this is a constraint, right? They think that, oh yeah, a neighboring state that wants to go to war with our free society, they have an advantage military-wise because they can just, requisition property. If their armies want to build a bridge or something, they can just conscript local workers. They can just grab the steel or the wood or whatever it is, the nails they need. They don't have to pay for it. They can just do all sorts of things like that. And that's supposed to be an advantage to them, whereas we're talking about private firms embedded in this voluntary framework of a free society where there's no institutional violation of property rights. So it can't be that some firm systematically commits crime or destroys things, it violates property rights in general. That would be a criminal activity. And it can't just say, well, we need to defend ourselves. So in particular, the one where a lot of people think this would be a constraint is when it comes to the draft. Okay, so foreign armies, they would be allowed to draft their citizens into the army, and they could have huge armies that way. In the free society, there would be no analog. Private firms could not get people to work for them and defend, the free society against their will, because that would be slavery or kidnapping. You can't do that. And so what I'm trying to tell you here is that's a good thing. You don't want them to be able to do that historically it hurts those societies where they tolerate their government drafting people. Okay, and so just think of it, I'll do like a sort of economic argument first, and then I'll try to make it more practical and appeal to history. So as far as the economics of it, labor is a resource just like anything else. And especially as we get into more modern warfare, it's not obvious that the best thing for every single human being to do is to just go to the front lines and get shot at or shoot at somebody else, right? There's all sorts of roles that people play in the modern division of labor to supplement the war effort. And so when you start thinking of it that way, just all the standard problems of central planning, just like if you're saying, hey, we want to maximize food production, we've got millions of people at our disposal, how do we do it? You wouldn't want central planners just telling all the people where to go and say, okay, you guys over there, you go work on farms, you people work at a distribution center, you people build 18-wheelers because we need to be able to transport the food around. You guys work on refrigeration units. You see what I'm saying? There's a lot that goes on as you get into a modern economy, even for something like just food production. And the same holds for something like defend the society from a military attack. It's not obvious, for example, how many people should be snipers? How many people should be working in demolition? How many people should be doing R&D, making new weapons? How many people should be working in the factory that makes bullets? How many people should be working on making new types of body armor, right? There's all sorts of things going on, and it's not at all obvious who should go into what occupation. And so when you have a draft, that just sort of swamps all that information that the market process and signals were giving to entrepreneurs. And you got a few central planners who work for the military just deciding this is how it's going to be. So in any other area, we would see that would be crazy, and that would stifle and cripple the effort. And there's nothing special or intrinsic to military attack or defense that all of a sudden, flips that on its head, and all of a sudden central planning is a really smart thing to do. Okay, so there's that element. Another way, let me motivate with some historical examples. So Jeffrey Rogers Hummel has a book called Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men. And he's talking about the U.S. war between the states, or Civil War. And he quotes some historians who were saying that on the eve of the Civil War in the United States, a lot of military historians and other experts thought that the South was going to be fine. The Confederate States would be fine, because after all, the U.S. itself had defeated the greatest empire in the world, when they fought off the British during the War for American Independence. And so they thought, okay, if the South engages in the same type of warfare, right, where they have guerrilla tactics, they're just hiding out in the woods, and if the Northern Union armies come in and they just take pot shots and run away, and they know the terrain better because it's their home, they thought the North's not going to be able to win, all right? And yet the South did lose. And let me just mention, in the War for Independence, when the U.S. colonies fought the British, part of what was happening there, and you see the problem with conscription, is the British troops, they were famously wearing red coats. So they'd be marching through the woods and sticking out like a sore thumb. There's guys in these bright red coats marching through, whereas The colonials, they were, dressed either, green things or stuff that blended in. They were in civilian clothes, and they could take pot shots and then run away into the town. You wouldn't know who was who. You wouldn't know who was a partisan or not. And so you might wonder, well, why didn't the British adopt similar tactics? Why didn't they have their troops dressed, in civilian clothes? And one of the reasons was because then they might defect. Okay, so because, again, those British troops were not there voluntarily. At least a lot of them weren't. They were conscripts. They didn't want to be there getting shot at. They might not have cared about keeping the colonies for the king. And so if they're there, part of the function of having those bright red uniforms was so that if they ran away, their commanders could find them, and also the people in the town would know, wait, you're not one of us, get out of here. You're an enemy and a soldier invader. Okay, so that was partly for the discipline and just maintaining the ranks of the invading force. And so you can see in a situation like that, whereas the partisan colonials who were taking shots at them in the woods like snipers and running away, they were defending their homeland. Nobody was forcing them to fight like that. They were just trying to repel invaders. Okay, so that just gives you an example of how that works. And so if some historians think if the Confederate States had adopted similar tactics, they would have been able to withstand the invasion from the Union forces. But that's not what the South did. The South had a draft. They got their troops in line. They gave them uniforms. And what did they have them do? Just think about it. They had them line up and march right into Union cannons and rifle fire. Okay, so it's perverse. It's like if the Confederate government just sat around thinking, how can we maximize how quickly our able-bodied men are slaughtered? I know, let's line them up and have them march right in front of Union firepower. And if we catch anybody not trying to do that, trying to do something that would allow them to live, we ourselves will shoot them. We'll use our police and say, hey, get over there and get shot. What are you doing? Okay? And so so it's kind of perverse, but that's, if you think through, that's what happens with conscription. Or especially if you read about the battles of World War I, when it really got going, and you'd have the different, the trenches set up in some of those horrible killing fields where tens of thousands of casualties were happening per day, depending on which battle you're talking about. Again, the only reason such mass slaughter was possible was that both sides were conscripting their men and sending them into these killing fields, okay? That if you had had a free society, they wouldn't have done that, and so they wouldn't have lost one of their most valuable resources, so easily. So that's partly what I'm getting at here, is that when there's conscription, what happens is, among other ways of thinking about it, besides the moral horror of just millions of people, being taken against their will and forced to be either killed or be killed, besides the moral problem, just economically, just think of it dispassionately, as a robot or something. Those are very valuable resources, right? When you're getting invaded, one of your most valuable resources is the people at your disposal. And the last thing you want to do is have people in charge of them and their allocation thinking they have virtually a zero price. And yet that's what the infantry are to military commanders. They're almost free. And yeah, they're not just going to sacrifice tens of thousands of troops for no reason, but they're not fully internalizing the cost of that. And they're certainly not recognizing, oh, wait a minute, we just killed somebody who was a great chemical engineer. He might have been able, if he had been out working in a lab somewhere, he might have come up with a better bomb. But instead, we, gave him a rifle and told him to go take a hill, and he got mowed down with machine gun fire. And now we, not only is that guy dead, but now we don't have the new bombs that he would have invented had he been placed somewhere else where he should have been. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that, in general, market prices do, is they ensure resources go to where they're most urgently needed. And so in the kind of framework I'm talking about here, again, it's those life insurance companies that would be paying bounties. So just to talk a little bit more about that, the insurance company might say, you're faced with an incoming invader. They might say, okay, for every enemy helicopter you knock down, we'll pay your firm $10,000. For every infantry that you take out of commission, whether you kill them or just, shoot their kneecap or something so that they're out for the fight, we'll give you whatever, $800. They would set prices, and they wouldn't be arbitrary. They would run calculations, just like actuaries can figure out if you're a smoker, how much more does that cost us as a life insurance company, and the premiums are adjusted. Likewise, you got an incoming army, they could figure out, at least come up with some estimate as to say, how valuable is it? How much would we be willing to pay to take out one of those incoming bombers? And they would give bounties accordingly. And so then the private firms hiring workers voluntarily would figure out, what's this person's marginal revenue product in terms of this particular occupation in this line, right? So That's the way you would have so-called rationality and economic calculation in something as esoteric as military defense. So again, a draft means the people running that operation think that the workers are basically free, when no, they're very valuable, and you want them to know what the opportunity cost is. Likewise, when it comes to something like blowing up infrastructure inside your own society. So this is a common technique that if you're retreating and the invaders are coming in, you do stuff like blow up bridges, like just to hamper the enemy's ability to quickly cover terrain. So they might do that. The private firms, especially if it doesn't go well the first couple of days and the outside states coming in and penetrating, they might do stuff like blow up roads. Or in a free society, who would blow up the roads? The companies would, the private companies. That's who. We've got that question handled too. All right. And so, blow up bridges, stuff like that. That's fine, but they would have to pay the owners. They couldn't just blow up stuff and say, well, we're defending from this foreign invasion. They would have to pay for it. Just like, right now, if a plane's flying and crashes and takes out a house somewhere, the airline company or their insurers or somebody has to compensate the owner for that. You can't just say, well, we got to have air travel. Occasionally some people's houses get blown up and that's not our fault. Right? You pay for stuff. You don't ban air travel, but the point is if your business operation entails the loss of other people's property, you got to indemnify them in a free society. So that would happen here. And again, that's a good thing. We don't want agencies that have the power to just go around blowing up property. For all we know, that bridge is more important so that the munitions being made in the factories can get brought to the front lines somewhere else, right? So maybe by blowing up that bridge, that one firm thinking it was helping actually is crippling the defense effort, right? And so how do you know? Market prices. That's how you know, right? So the other firm that's really relying on that bridge, maybe they're paying so much to the owner, and the other firm comes along and says, I actually think, we'd be willing to pay you $800,000 to take this bridge out because we got these plans, this operation we're doing to stop these invading tanks, and your bridge is really a pain, a thorn in our side. Let's take it. We'll pay $800,000. But the other factory might say, no, we'll pay you $900,000 to keep that thing in operation, right? So that's the way the different firms that have different ideas for how can we defend, that's how they compete, and that's how it gets settled through the market price system. Okay, and here's one that's even more esoteric. Even when it comes to blowing up the enemy hardware or killing enemy troops, it's not clear to me what the legal status would be. So we got a free society, judges make rulings, and it's clear cut in the boundaries of the free society what the legal system is and who owns what. But it's not as obvious to me what is the legal status in the Rothbardian courts of outside, like U.S. government assets, right? Like, does the U.S. government, is it its own corporation and it owns all of its tanks? It's not clear to me how that would be true. Or is that like the taxpayers in the U.S. own that? And, you see what I'm saying? So it's not obvious to me exactly how that would play out. But for sure, what would happen if it is the case, like let's say that the defending forces want to do a preemptive strike. And so like let's say it's the British or the U.S. for whatever reason are about to invade. And they're saying, if we knocked out some of their spy satellites and some of their reconnaissance aircraft, like the drones and whatever, that would really help us when they pull the trigger and they really invade us if we have first neutralized some of that stuff, knock out their recon or whatever. So maybe they have to, take out some of that stuff before the war officially starts. They would be able to do that, but they'd have to pay for it, right? Because you're blowing up property. And I think the way they could do it fairly cheaply is if they go to U.S. taxpayers and say, hey, in our legal system, you have been, the U.S. government stole $100,000 from you over the last 3 years. They owe you that money plus interest plus, pain and suffering. We all know you're not getting that anytime soon. So why don't you give us your claim against the U.S. government for $106,000 and we'll give you 2% of the face value for that because you're not ever seeing that money. And so maybe they would do it that way so that the private defense firms could load up with a lot of claims against the invading forces just vis-a-vis their own taxpayers. And that's how legally they could show, we caused $600 million of damage to them. And here we go. And this is how we compensate for it because they've caused $600 million of damage to their own people that we've acquired for, $5 million payment. And here you go. So again, that might seem like quibbling and, oh my gosh, you're worried, Bob, about violating the property rights of these invaders. Yes, I am, right? And that's a good thing. That's our strength, is that we respect property rights. And so even in a situation like this where the courts rule no, technically they didn't send a cruise missile over our border yet, so you can't really knock out their surveillance satellite, or else that's aggression. Well, we could compensate them for that. All right. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where that actually is our strength. That's why we would have such a potent military defense, is because we would be guided by profit and loss signals. Okay. Let me, in the time I have left here, just try to deal with some objections people might have, or ways to help clarify thinking through this process, because I know it's tricky when you first encounter it. Okay, so one thing is just make sure you're always doing an apples to apples comparison. So yes, if everybody in this room just reads Rothbard, and then I took you back in time and it's you guys versus Nazi Germany, I'm pretty sure Nazi Germany is going to beat us in this room, okay? But likewise, Nazi Germany defeated France, right? And they had a state military at their disposal. Okay, so you can't just say, I can dream up a scenario where a private society of, free individuals would lose to a state, therefore private defense doesn't work, because likewise, I can think of countless examples where state militaries failed to defend their country from an outside invasion. So therefore, I guess state provision of defense doesn't work either. Okay, so it's always an apples to apples. The claim is not that private defense makes you invulnerable, but that other things equal, it's the best way to defend yourself. Just like if you're saying, hey, we want to have the best automobiles or the best computers or the best food, how do you do it? You don't say, oh, well, let's put the state in charge of that because that's really important for our society, so we want to have government running it. No, you'd say leave it to private enterprise. That's the way, given whatever our skill set is and our natural resources and so on, that's the best way to maximize quality in that particular sector. So likewise here. Another way of just, again, seeing the advantage that the free society has, there's no monopoly on the ideas, right? So the insurance companies, for one thing, there's multiple ones. So maybe some of them have different ideas about the relative value of foreign targets. So they might set different prices accordingly. It's not just going to be a case of groupthink, but also there's competition. And so you wouldn't have all your eggs in one basket, like in France, famously in World War II, they had the Maginot Line, and Hitler just went right around that, okay? And so here, since there's not just one group of people in charge of defending the society, but there's competition. So some people might try conventional methods. So, a lot of people might be ex-military from other countries, but there might be some people that are totally new, and they just come up with a brand new idea that will totally shock the state militaries. Also, by the way, let me see if I put it in here. Yeah, the ANCAP society is going to be fantastically wealthy. So for a lot of this stuff, don't think of it as this relatively tiny little country against the big bad United States. Think of it as like the Jetsons versus the United States, okay? And as much of a, bumbling fool as George Jetson is with all that technology, they could probably fight circles around them. So just as an example, just probably if you had a firm and it had 10 years to do it, and had $10 billion to spend, they could probably come up with a system where they could have a bunch of drones. So some enemy comes in, a bunch of drones get deployed, they go and attach themselves like to the treads of tanks and just have minor explosions, not to blow the whole tank up, but just to incapacitate it, and little things that go on the necks of the invading infantry. And so they can track them, right, like little things that they can, so they know where they are. And if they get near sensitive targets, you press a thing and it releases something in their bloodstream and just knocks them out. Okay, so I'm not saying that's the whole thing, but that took me 15 minutes to think of, right? And so if you have a society, of 1 million people or more, and it's not like, especially if it's like the U.S. or something, they would have to first have a propaganda campaign before they could just start dropping bombs on some other, society. So people would know it was coming. They would have time to prepare. And again, the funding would be there, and they would be, if you don't think they would be fantastically wealthy compared to the other statist-controlled societies, then I don't think you've understood the case for freedom, right? That you don't understand how much, even like in the United States, which is relatively free compared to a lot of places, how poor we are because of what the state does. Easily, we'd be 3 times as wealthy in a few years, I think, if you got rid of all the state apparatus, okay? So with that much margin for error, I think it's clear. It would be like the U.S. versus Vietnam with the technological roles reversed. Okay, so just think through part of how it was hard for the U.S. forces to beat them was because of the guerrilla warfare. Imagine if the Viet Cong, in addition to having those tactics that made them tricky to snuff out, also had technology that was way more advanced than what the U.S. troops had. that's the kind of way to think about it. You can see that the U.S. probably would not have persisted in trying to conquer them. Okay, another thing too is I think a lot of people don't realize just how inefficient state militaries are. And this kind of goes back to that earlier thing I said when sometimes libertarians, and you get how they're trying to be funny when they'll say stuff like, oh yeah, the government's awful at everything except blowing things up and killing people, ha ha. And no, this is what I'm saying is no, actually, if it really came down to it, the private sector could kill people way more efficiently, okay? Now, I actually don't think in practice they would, like other things equal. If you want to cripple an invading force, you actually don't want to kill their infantry. You just want to make it so they can't fight and just have a bunch of people there, you know, that they still have to take care of and feed and house, and the other troops see them, like, you know, if you somehow could make it so they couldn't walk or whatever. Like, that's actually more militarily effective than killing them. And so I'm just showing you that the way militaries think is not correct in terms of the overall strategy. But just to give you an idea here, anyone know Dan Carlin, the Hardcore History podcast? So I was listening to his thing on World War I, and it was amazing that he was saying that so that, you know, it starts in the summer of 1914 and up through late 1915, most of the armies, they were still issuing felt caps to their soldiers. Okay, so something as little as that, something as, you know, like the governments, they could have, instead of drafting, let's say 10,000 of those troops and sending them to the front lines where many of them were slaughtered within weeks, instead of having an extra 10,000 people just being back home, cranking out steel helmets. That would have made much more sense, just that little tweak in how they were running their operations. So I'm saying just imagine that times 1,000 especially if it's a long, drawn-out campaign. Also, the more something like World War I, that was largely a logistical supply issue, like which nations could outproduce the other ones. It didn't come down to tactics. It came down to how much material could they produce. So again, just showing you in modern warfare, this idea that a free society is a sitting duck with a bullseye on it compared to a state is crazy. Okay, last point here I'll make, and then I'll wrap up. The classic question, people say, wouldn't warlords take over? All right, and so it's ironic that people say, all right, I'm really worried about one of these defense agencies getting so large that maybe they start taking money from their customers against their will, and they start killing people that they shouldn't, and so that's why we have a state. Right? It's like saying, you know, the worst thing that could happen is that one of these companies would turn into a state, and therefore we should have a state. Let's just get I don't want to have anxiety about it. Let's just get it over with. Rip the Band-Aid off. All right, so there's that element. Beyond that, though, to be a little bit fairer, what they have in mind, the person who makes this argument, is to say, well, no, if we have like a constitutional system and we agree ahead of time on the framework for these periodic elections and the role of the government, the kind of government we get under that setting or in that setting is going to be more humane and controllable than one that emerges, from your ANCAP system sort of accidentally. And there I would just say, and I have an article with this title if you want to go look at it, but there I just make the point that the type of people who could contain a government, so for which a constitutional limited government system would work, the kind of people necessary to make that happen, and thus far in history, no such people have existed, right? Because there has been no government that's been contained. But the kind of people that could make that work, also, if you had multiple competing defense agencies, if one of them started getting aggressive, they would just switch their business elsewhere, right? So if you're the kind of person that once you saw dictatorship emerging, you would go vote for somebody else next election, well, then you can just switch your business too. So it's like if limited government would work for a given set of people, preventing tyranny would work so much better if they were totally free in the Rothbardian sense. Okay, that's my time. Thanks, everybody.
All right, so I didn't plan on playing that entire video for the video version. It was most of the video. However, I thank you guys for bearing with me here. Obviously, Bob Murphy is fun to listen to, and he's real funny. So I would strongly stress that you guys all go and read this article by Holcomb that I was talking about. I didn't want to read the whole thing because there's a lot of stuff here. So there wasn't too much that I didn't read, so just a few pages here, but I think it's worth taking a look at. And I would stress that it's important for all of us to grapple with these ideas that we don't agree with, lest we become an echo chamber. And we really should expand our minds by evaluating these arguments of people that we don't agree with as well. So just in summation, then Bob Murphy envisions a society where it would mainly be insurance companies that would provide national defense. It's possible. I think that's one vision that could emerge, but frankly, we don't really know exactly what the market would produce in an anarchist system. It'd be really interesting to see what came about, but a lot of the points that he makes there are legitimate and kind of the same points as to how it would actually work or how it could work. Specifically, the point he made about millions and millions of minds in the marketplace of ideas coming up with solutions to these problems. So, well, thanks a lot for listening. Like I said, I'm going to go and I'm going to edit that Bob Murphy video in post for the audio version. But for the video version, let's see here. You can find on youtube.com, but here, /Liberty Weekly. But here is my website, libertyweekly.net. I'm glad to be kind of getting back to semi-regular episodes, and I plan on continuing as long as we're in the video version. I'm starting a new podcast with my wife that should be dropping here pretty soon. We're recording the final episodes, but it's unhallowedpodcast.com. The show is called Unhallowed. It's a gothic horror podcast. It won't have a whole lot of politics in it, but my feelings about politics will creep in certain ways that won't be explicit. But we have a few episodes coming up. We have episodes 1 and 2 recorded, but I'm really excited to start that with my wife, and should be a very fun project. So check that out. I'll put a link in the show notes page, unhallowedpodcast.com. As well, you can support in various ways if you go to libertyweekly.net. Patreon is one way. There's a PayPal option as well. Let's see if you can donate with cryptocurrency as well, and I really need to put my addresses on here. But anyways, really been into crypto trading lately. So yeah, check me out. I really appreciate you guys watching and listening. It's always fun to hang out with you guys. I hope you're doing well, and we'll catch you next time.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.